a faculty member for SEAHO's RELI, as well as the National Housing Institute, National Housing Training Institute, and the Professional Standards Institute. So today, I will describe how UCF Housing and Residence Life staff collected and used data to make informed decisions and assess freshly reconfigured programs and services during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to invite you all to share your perspectives as well. We are going to be using Mentimeter, which is available at menti.com, menti.com. And you want to enter code 5092613. And I'll show that again in a minute. That'll be our kind of effort to have some ongoing engagement throughout the presentation. All right, we're still admitting a few folks, but welcome everybody. Again, my name is Dr. Virginia Koch. Nice to meet you all and glad you're here. So my first slide, I just want to kind of get a sense of who is participating. If you want to put your name in, you can, but also go ahead and just tell me your title and your institution. And you can use that with Mentimeter and put in that code 5092613. And hopefully we'll start seeing some responses. An area coordinator, yay. Glad to see some area coordinators joining. Director of Residence Life. Area directors, graduate assistants. So these will keep popping up as you enter information. I'll let it go for another minute. But it's kind of nice to get a sense of who's in the room and who I'm talking to. So appreciate your participation. There we go. Folks figuring this out. Okay. All right, lots of good folks, all levels of directors, assistant directors, executive directors. I know I've got some friends from University of Central Florida joining me. Appreciate your all being here. So lots of good folks. And lots of areas that you're working in, different areas within a housing structure. I see, res life and facilities and, marketing probably, and some other good areas. So conferences, manager of inventory. Okay, so thank you for that. I do want to move along and oh, yay, an assessment analysis analyst from Florida State. I think I'm going to your presentation next. Okay, thank you. So for today's learning outcomes, I am going to, let's see, sorry, I'm just fooling with my view. Okay, for today's learning outcomes, I am going to not read these to you, but just to kind of tell you how we're going to achieve them. So a majority of the slides will relate to our learning outcome 1, which is really about, this program is going to be pretty content rich. And you'll be able to refer back to the slides later. There's a lot of information on some of the slides. But then the other 2 learning outcomes we're going to achieve through Mentimeter and your participation and hopefully gaining access to responses on how things are going on your campuses. So I want to think back to a year ago for, that seems like a century maybe for some of us, but think back 1 year ago to February 23rd, 2020. We were at SEAHO or around that time. And it was a time when the US was concerned about COVID, but there are only about 35 cases reported. So little did we know that March 13th, the US would declare a national state of emergency for COVID-19, and our campuses would start to move to remote learning, remote working, and depopulating our residential facilities. We started to use words like unprecedented and uncertain to describe our experience and searching for the best ways to pivot our operations. So here we are 1 year later with over 500,000 people that have passed due to COVID. So when we think about COVID and past pandemics and outbreaks, by now you've probably heard about the 1918 pandemic that occurred. And it was even more devastating than the one we're experiencing right now in many ways. But I just want to remind you, there have also been lots of other pandemics or outbreaks of disease that have impacted our traditional campus operations. I remember in the mid-2000s, I was working at housing at another institution, and there was the avian flu was a big topic of discussion. And I was appointed to a university-wide committee to develop a pandemic response plan. But actually avian flu kind of disappeared as a concern fairly quickly, and the committee was disbanded before we were able to make much progress on the plan. So there's probably lots of places where that happened, and the idea of planning is always one of those things we're going to get to, but it doesn't always seem to happen. Around also in the mid-2000s, there was this paper published with a Hawaii called the Campus Housing Guidelines for Pandemic Planning. And it was written by Norb Dunkel from the University of Florida, Tom Ellett, and some others. And they outlined considerations for planning for a pandemic. And many of their guidelines in this 4-page paper were spot on. They addressed preparedness, planning, response, and recovery. And they had 2 assessment-related guidelines. So one was to schedule a post-event debriefing to determine areas of, I can't read my slide, to areas of process and procedure improvement, and also to complete a event financial impact analysis. Well, those are definitely 2 things we want to do, but now we've certainly learned that there's a lot more assessment that needs to happen. And this was one of the only documents that existed for some time. The actual link to the document is at the top of the slide. Then throughout the next 15 years or so, there were occasional articles on pandemic resources that were in the talking stick, available in the Hawaii library from different presentations that folks have done. And that was about it. So, of course, other associations have done some work in this area, but from a housing perspective, it was kind of on our radar, but not as much. So I'm curious, did your campus have a pandemic plan prior to COVID-19? Yes, no, somewhat, or I don't know. Interesting. So we have one campus that said yes so far. Looks like most people said no, a bunch of people didn't know, and a few somewhats. So that's interesting. Don't know who the one who said yes is. Do you want to identify yourself? Anyone? It's okay if you don't want to, that's all right. All right, well, thank you for that. Yeah, you'll see that's not too surprising, I suppose. So before we move on, I want to tell you a little bit about UCF. We were founded almost 60 years ago in 1963, and we're located in Orlando, Florida. We're a Research One metropolitan university with over 70,000 students enrolled. That we're actually the 2nd largest university in the country. A lot of folks don't seem to know that, but there you go. And almost half of our students are minorities. And we were designated a Hispanic serving institution in 2019. So pretty diverse student population. And we have a very large campus in Orlando, which is our main campus with over 1,400 acres. I was a geography major in college, or part of one of my majors. So I always like knowing that kind of stuff. But we have 800 acres of woodlands, lakes, and an arboretum on campus that help connect students with nature. I think that's pretty cool. But we do have 3 nearby campuses, the downtown campus, Rosen campus, and Lake Nona Medical City, as well as the UCF Connect centers, which are located in 11 different Florida cities. And our housing program has, when we're at capacity, over 11,000 students in 14 communities with 200 about 200 RAs, 21 graduate assistants, and 15 coordinators that are live-in staff on campus. And again, the communities are located mostly on our main campus, but also on the downtown and Rosen campus. So when we think about March last year when COVID hit, we were all kind of in the midst of flying our airplanes, and then we had to start changing things in mid-flight. I love this quote, without data, you are another person with an opinion. And all of a sudden, what we thought we knew didn't really make as much sense. So we really had to start figuring out what was the basis of making decisions. Things were happening very fast and furious, and everybody was doing the best they could with the information they had. But we knew that we needed to start collecting and using data to help guide our decision making. So to that end, we have this 5-step assessment process I'll just review this, starting with the planning process. What are our goals, objectives, and metrics? What are we trying to achieve? Next, we have our assessment strategies and methods. What data do we need and how will we collect the data? We need to look at the results and start to have a reflection and analysis, and then work to create some improvement actions. What are those? What's working? What do we need to change? And then put those things into action, and then continue with our planning, objectives, metrics, and the cycle continues. And you'll see these icons throughout the presentation to kind of help you map where we are moving forward. So most of the world will make decisions by either guessing or using their gut. They will be either lucky or wrong. And that's a tech industry entrepreneurs who made that now relevant quote. But we knew that for us, failure was not an option. So we did have some goals, objectives, and metrics. And, one of the big things was just-in-time decision-making. We had to reopen and maintain our housing program under different circumstances, of course, but we really needed to be able to understand and address student and staff well-being concerns in the process of doing that. We wanted to be able to measure students' stakeholder satisfaction with the modified programs and services, share our data with staff and campus partners, and also use the data to celebrate successes and offer encouragement. For our objectives, we wanted to meet our occupancy goals, which of course were shifted, support the housing and residence life staff, provide innovative virtual community building and marketing opportunities, and provide contact-free resident move-in and other services. And the metrics, among many others, were occupancy, student and staff well-being, resident participation, satisfaction, and learning achievement. So here you start to see some of the assessment strategies. We had to use contact-free strategies, which, maybe in the past we would have done some things in person, but, we were using a lot of surveys, quizzes, benchmarking, tracking usage, longitudinal comparison across all aspects of our operation. We also use the data collection methods such as Qualtrics surveys, Skyfactor resident assessment and student staff assessment, networking with peer institutions, reviewing results of ACUHO-I straw polls, and benchmarking against recommended practices. And we also looked at information that we could gather from Skype, Outlook, and StarRes reports. So constantly using a lot of that information to guide our assessment practices. Now here we have a timeline of the assessment that we did in 2020. And I have some little icons on here I'll explain. So here we have kind of when COVID started, that interruption of service, moving students out of the residence halls. If they hadn't already moved out, we had a process for doing that, started in June. Looking at testing all the students when they started coming back in the fall, and also moving all of our online engagement, or our engagement to online virtual engagement. And then here we have the availability of vaccinations starting. So I have a whole list of questions, and I'm going to help you kind of get a sense of what we're looking for with these various surveys that I have kind of listed here. So we wanted to know all kinds of things, such as what questions do our staff have for our COVID-19 campus leader panel? We did a panel discussion for staff, and we solicited all their questions that they had, and then grouped them into a script of questions that we could ask a group of experts from around campus that we provided to our staff. There were so many unknowns and a lot of misinformation running around early in the pandemic. So we really wanted to get that information out. We also wanted to look at, how do staff who've been worked remotely feel about returning to campus? And what are staff plans for quarantine and isolation if they test positive? What are students' plans for quarantine and isolation if they test positive for COVID-19? One of our questions was, do you have a plan? And then if they said no, or I'm working on it, that was also an indicator for us. Were residents, parents, and guardians satisfied with the contactless check-in process and move-in procedures that we established? Is RA implementation of our residential curriculum working as we planned? Did students achieve the learning goals established for the community meetings? That was a big focus for us. After living on campus for a few months, what were students struggling with the most, and how can UCF and our housing and res life staff help them? Do students plan to return to the residence halls after Thanksgiving break, even though all classes will be remote? And we found that a surprising number were planning to return. How does student satisfaction with programs and services compare to non-COVID years? Doing the resident assessment in November helped us to get a sense of that. And lastly, how do RA satisfaction with their positions compare to non-COVID years? And what is residence life and education doing well, and how can they improve? So all of these surveys yielded over 12,000 responses from individuals and helped to inform our planning and response throughout the pandemic last year. Moving into this year, we do plan to offer a number of those same assessments, especially in the latter half of the year, but you'll see there's some blank spaces because we're probably going to be adding new surveys. One that we just came up with this month was a housing lottery for non-participants survey. So we sent out a survey to all those who did not participate in our lottery to find out why they were choosing not to participate to live on campus for next year. I should mention these icons. In January, we have a faculty member who started a research project looking at screening wastewater from 5 of our residence halls to detect the presence of coronavirus. And in mid-February, on February 11th, our first UCF student was identified with the coronavirus UK variant. Fortunately, they live off campus, but we do know that the variant is present on campus. Again, we'll be replicating some of the other surveys that we were able to do last year, but we still have room for doing more. So here's some examples of some of the data-driven decisions that we were able to make based on the different surveys that we were compiling. And, you know, we, of course, had to, you know, review these, review the different results that we were receiving. And, you know, I'll just go through a few of these. We designed I mentioned the virtual panel for staff around the questions that they submitted. We had to create a pandemic-proof plan, which for institutional effectiveness reporting, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Supervisors had to address staff concerns expressed in the survey with, you know, obviously they had a number of concerns that were individual to them that we tried to get a sense of. And depending on their position, because frankly, some of our staff never left campus. They were always working on campus with those positions. So their concerns were different from the staff that were working remotely from home and whatnot. And adjusting our isolation and quarantine plans to accommodate larger number of students based on people's replies to those questions. Looking at our residential curriculum and how we could adjust the lesson plans for spring semester. And replicating some of our successes. So we were able to know what worked well and continue doing those things and building on that. And also using the results for encouraging staff. So these ones in red are the ones I'm going to go into in a little more detail right now. So we have, I assume your school does too, but you know, at UCF, we have a pretty extensive institutional effectiveness program, and we do this for accrediting purposes, but it's the big emphasis is on using our data to improve our practice. And we do 3-year cycles of assessing various outcomes. So we're in the 3rd year of assessing outcomes for most of these. And we ran into a snafu because some of the data that we planned to collect was connected to events that were planned after we had depopulated the residence halls in the spring. So we had to go back and see if we had additional data from other assessments that we had done that we could substitute for the outcomes that we had originally listed. This planning process for institutional effectiveness starts about a year before a given assessment year. So of course we had no idea that we'd be running into this problem. But where you see these directional arrows, those represent, you know, where we had to completely change the direction for our assessment. We were able to substitute another living learning community signature program, as well as another staff training assessment that we had done, and then report the results of those in place of what we weren't able to accomplish because of COVID. Our Housing Leadership Institute we collected data from that as well, and we were planning to do a follow-up survey with students so many months after they had completed it. And when that assessment was supposed to go out was right around the time COVID happened, so that assessment got forgotten about, and we had to like push it back and try to collect data in May, which didn't work out too well because people had already been out of the halls for several months. But we were able to collect some data and you know, apply some learning from those 3 experiences. So thinking ahead, we had to think about, well, we're still doing institutional effectiveness planning evaluation in a pandemic. So we had to pandemic proof our plans so that we wouldn't run into some of these same problems. So we were able to select some different outcomes because we were at the end of that 3-year cycle. We evaluated all 3 programs early in the fall semester. So we were able to, we kind of planned it that way so that if we did run into problems, then we hopefully would be able to, substitute some other assessments or programs later in the year if need be. And then we also continue to use best practice of embedding assessment into our lesson plans. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So here, we had our institutional effectiveness plan. You see the check marks. I love check marks. We were able to accomplish all 3 of the data collection in a 2-month span. So we were able to, collect all the data and start to analyze it and apply it to things that we're planning for next year, which is part of the purpose of assessment, right? So using that pandemic proof approach has helped us a lot. So here, dig a little deeper. One of the residential curriculum assessments that we did had to do with our first community meeting, which is something that everybody does probably, where you have your first RA meeting with the residents, but this was a virtual meeting. So we everybody was a little apprehensive about how this was going to work, frankly. We did have a really good attendance and over 2,600 students completed the post-event survey. So we knew pretty strongly from those who completed the survey that they were happy with the setup of the virtual community meetings. 94% said they were very or somewhat likely to attend a future community meeting. That was a big, in my mind, big plus for our staff, because it was showing that the students were willing to come to more meetings like this. And it also showed that residents were pretty savvy about online engagement. And, by the time we were doing this survey in August, they had already been doing this for about 6 months. So they were even providing us with suggestions about how to make future community meetings more fun and engaging. And one of the suggestions that we included in the spring plans were using Kahoots. They also were enthusiastic about giving suggestions for activities that they could do with each other throughout the fall semester. So it really showed some enthusiasm for being here, for being on campus, for wanting to participate in our events. We also, related to our institutional effectiveness, we looked at one student learning outcome, and we phrased it this way: 80% of residents who participate in the first community meeting and complete a post-event evaluation will demonstrate familiarity with policies and procedures for successfully living on campus. 2 measures were included. So we wanted to see if they could identify 3 reasons to contact the RA on duty, because obviously it's they're going to see the RAs less. So we wanted to know they knew how to do that, and that they understood some of the COVID-19 policies. And we exceeded the expectations on both of those measures. So I was happy to see that. The last area I want to kind of dig into a little bit before we get to some sharing is talking about our Skyfactor resident assessment. So the resident assessment, is something that we've done every year. We did have to miss last year because of COVID. We usually would have administered that in March or April and couldn't do it. So we did move our administration to the fall, which is the first time we've done that in many years, if ever, frankly. But we did that for a number of reasons, and not all COVID related. But one big reason is that we wanted to use the data to help inform improvements for spring semester. So if there were key areas that needed to get addressed, we were able to do that. One of the things that we found is that our satisfaction with students' sense of belonging actually increased, and maybe not surprisingly, this year, because with a COVID year than we've had in previous years. And obviously, you know, living on campus is different, but it's probably a lot better than living at home and attending college as a first year student, you know, from your bedroom at your parents' house. So they really found value in feeling like they were more connected to the university and just by living on campus, and we were able to show that that was the case. We also were able, they have some institutional specific questions, which is a great feature of Skyfactor. And we were able to ask some UCF COVID-19 specific questions that we were able to share with other administrators and give them a sense of how people were feeling about the policies and, you know, what some potential areas for improving or for educating residents, like this idea that, you know, residents aren't comfortable confronting students who are not adhering to policies. So, you know, whether that's their roommates or their friends or just people they happen upon on campus, if they're not wearing a mask or any of those requirements, they are a little uncomfortable talking to others about it. So Skyfactor was really helpful to us to get a sense of how the residents were feeling. We did do the survey in October, which was also looking at residents, how they were feeling, like what were some of their biggest struggles. And we also had a high participation in that. We had about 900 students participate in that survey and about 1,300 participate in the Skyfactor resident assessment. So, you know, it's given us a lot of good information to consider moving forward. So some of the ways that we share information, you know, we've been able to provide overviews of some of the surveys that we've done at monthly all staff meetings, which of course are on Zoom. We've been able to provide survey reports in an archive that's available to everybody on the professional staff through Microsoft Teams. We have a department newsletter that goes out twice a month, and I've been able to write short articles talking about some of the things that we've learned through some of the assessments and give folks food for thought on how they can apply what we're learning from those assessments to their work. And then we've also shared the results internally with folks that need to know for specific projects that they're working on, as well as externally with various stakeholders, such as our student health services and other folks. So try to do as much sharing as we can. Lots and lots of things that we've learned. Some of our successes. You know, my position is new, and you know, I was able to kind of just in time create a lot of these surveys and help out. Frankly, everybody's stretched pretty thin, so you know, we were able to really work with folks. If they had a survey that they were interested in creating, I was able to help them out and get that going fairly quickly. Embedding a lot of our assessments into the lesson plan or event design. I formed a new assessment and research committee with some folks that were able to help me to analyze qualitative data and turn it around in a timely manner. And then also documenting a lot of our pandemic planning and the lessons learned, so that we're able to carry on an ongoing you know, just record of what it is we're doing and what's working well. Some opportunities that we can take moving forward, you know, collecting information on data usage is something we can probably do better with. I've created our committee has created a form for that, so that we could start to get a sense of what folks are, how folks are using the information to spur decision making. We are communicating out with stakeholders and about data findings is also another thing that'll be ongoing. We don't have a lot of information on our website currently. Probably want to do more with that. In the last session, or the first session with the opening, they talked about surveying folks who were in quarantine and isolation. Our department hasn't done much of that, but it's certainly something that we could do to get a sense of what their experience is like. We know we have a lot of anecdotal information, but also kind of pulling that together. So I think there's just opportunities to help stakeholders kind of connect the dots between the data we're collecting and how decisions are made. That's a marker of, transparency. So we want to be able to really use our data to help folks see why some decisions are getting made if they're not being made above us. So now pull out your menti.com. I know we had some new folks join while I was talking. So if you want to go to menti.com and use the code 5092613, I'd like you to just give me some examples of some successes that you've seen from the assessment that you've been able to do on your campuses. And the next slide will be about opportunities. So if you want to participate in that one more than this one, that's okay too. What successes have you seen with assessment on your campuses? Hi, Jerry, I just saw you there. Good to see you. All right, increased overall satisfaction and sense of belonging in fall of 2020, residential experience survey. Thank you. Students reporting higher engagement in surveys than we were hearing anecdotally. Yes. Sharing data with campus partners. If you prefer to share your experience, you can also unmute yourself and share a quick story. Leading new RA assessment committee, conducting focus groups and surveys to better understand the student experience. That's awesome. Great. Well, I know sometimes we really have to think about what the successes are. So I'm going to leave it there and we'll move on to the next question about opportunities. It could be that honestly, in knowing that some staffs have really suffered with, depletion of staff, layoffs, furloughs, what have you, maybe you just didn't have time to do assessment. I don't know. And that's okay. But any opportunities that you noticed that you'd like to share? I love the idea of using data to share with staff in a digestible manner. Yes. Virtual focus groups. And, I will mention about the articles that I've been posting to our staff newsletter. They're very short. They're less, I try to be like less than 300 words, and then there'll be like a link to another document if they want to see like a full chart or something, because those don't always transfer well to the newsletter format. but try to just make it one quick nugget of information that they can chew on for a minute. Also recognizing that it's tough for staff. And the virtual focus groups I like that opportunity too, because that's it's something that's fairly easy to do. We've just gathering people's opinions on things is sometimes just easier to talk it through. So that's a good strategy. Student involvement with assessment creation and implementation. Yes, I did not talk about that, but that is a huge opportunity. And also involving students in the assessment analysis and making sense of the data is a huge opportunity. If you can pull in some RAs and say, here's some feedback we've gotten, what do you think of it? It adds a whole new dimension to understanding your data. And surveying students in quarantine and isolation. Yes, I would love to see examples of what questions folks are asking for that. Navigating over surveying and over emailing and creative solutions to get a better response rate. That's huge. I was really worried about our resident assessment. We have had pretty low response rates over the last few years, and I was really intentional about sending out a number of reminders to folks. Only the ones who don't opt out or haven't completed the survey get it. But they were really good about filling it out. We had the highest response rate we've had in years. So, and I had no incentives to offer. So they were just doing it out of their goodwill. And we also had a really big push with the staff to get the student staff to fill that out. But yes, over surveying can be a big issue. And I know our professional staff has gotten annoyed at us with some of the surveying that we've done, because it just gets a little much, at some point they're like, just do what we already asked you to do. So, all right, thanks for that. So last question, I think this is the last question I have for you is, what assessment questions should campuses explore moving forward? And I have a couple sample suggestions to get you thinking. So thinking about vaccinations, what percentage of staff plan to get vaccinated? When it becomes available? And for those who say that they don't want to be vaccinated, asking why. Is it that they don't know where to go? They are hesitant because of cultural or socio-political ideas. Will staff be willing to return to a double occupancy room next fall? Would students be interested and willing to return to a double occupancy room in the fall? That's a tricky question, because you don't want to ask that question if that's not going to be an option. So you never want to set yourself up for failure that way. Somebody wrote, what are some ideas that students have or want for engagement? Yes. I think that's kind of shows we got a lot of really good ideas from students on things that they wanted to do. And some of them already are in that online gaming environment, and they wanted to do more of that. And frankly, it's just like hooking them up with other UCF students that are interested in that. What do we need? Do we need isolation and quarantine spaces still next year? That's a great question. Will it just become a thing that people just choose to go home? If a lot of your students live regionally, that may be the easiest thing, and they know maybe they've already been in isolation or have friends who have done it and have no interest in staying on campus if that's what they have to do. Why students that live on campus actually choose to live on now? Yes. And what are the items and services that they value that we provide? That's wonderful. Yes. We actually asked some questions like that in one of our surveys, and had some interesting results. How do we support our, disappeared. How do we support our staff, students in full-time next school year after a full year of COVID? Yes, that will be huge. What support looks like over time is probably going to change. What markers do we look for to indicate ability to begin more in-person events? Yes. What are some of, that's a great question to ask. Evaluating new adopted policies, mask wearing, guest policies, etc. And do we loosen them? Yes. When do we start loosening them? What are some of those markers for considering changing those policies? You know, how do we support our staff next year? Yes. Did I miss one? I don't think so. So yes, those are things to start thinking about for future surveys. If you haven't done any surveys with your staff or students, and you are interested in some of the surveys that I've talked about that we've done, I'd be happy to share the entire survey with you so you get a sense of what was asked. You know, thinking about, you know, as you're doing some of the planning, thinking ahead to what needs to happen, I think is going to be really important. Are we over time? I'm so sorry, Bree. Yes, I see we are. Okay, so I just want to show you a couple more slides of takeaways. We'll skip that one today. I have some resources for you. These are all clickable links. I don't have, the new book on campus crisis management has an entire chapter, chapter 14, devoted to infectious and contagious disease. A lot of guidance for folks in that area, and it just came out a few weeks ago. And of course, there's some other resources here that you can click on. And before I close, I do want to thank my research and assessment committee for their help with this presentation: Eric Chrisman, Hayden Lau, Josh Robinson, and Jenna Saxon. So thank you all. I really appreciate your being here today and putting up with my being a little bit over time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this was a really great presentation. So thank you, Dr. Cook, for sharing all of your knowledge with us. I believe I can speak for her when I say that if you have questions, feel free to utilize this contact information that she's posted to ask questions and clarifications and things like that. She's been super great and responsive, so I'm sure she would love to hear from you. I did drop the program eval in the chat, so please make sure that you complete that so that we can get all of that wonderful information to Dr. Cook and she can hear how amazing she did. If you have any questions or concerns, you can put those in there as well. And she will get all of that information and can reach out as well. So thank you again. Let's give Dr. Cook a round of applause. Yay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here.